Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to talk to you guys today about three things. So, I'll start with a little bit of history of socialization of our species. I'll move on to the current state of alienation that a lot of people feel. And the third part, I'll end with how those two things connect with the state of our democracy today. So, let's start with a brief history of the socialization of our species. Let's go back 3.5 million years ago. 3.5 million years ago, our hominid ancestor, Lucy, walked the African savannas. There were two things, very specifically two things special about her. She was part of what we'd call Australopithecus afarensis species. Two things special about her. One was she walked upright. The second thing was she could throw. Now, that doesn't sound very special, does it? How many of you have played cricket? Nobody? Quite a few, right. And so you know how to throw very well. Do you know of any other species that can throw like you do? There aren't any. Nobody can throw like you do. Now, imagine you're not the strongest in the jungle. You're not the fastest in the jungle. But you have one thing nobody else has. You can throw very hard. You can throw very accurately. What happens? Imagine the Sunderbans today. Now, the Sunderbans, by most experts accounting, there are less than 100 Royal Bengal tigers in the Sunderbans today. But even in that scenario, place one person without any arms or ammunition in the middle of the Sunderbans, what does he become? Food for the Royal Bengal tiger. But instead of that one person, put in 50 or 100, what happens? If 100 people pick up rocks or stones and start throwing with accuracy and high speed at a Royal Bengal tiger, who wins? So you put in 100 people and you get a new apex predator. So that's where we started socialization. We needed people. Now let's move on to about 50,000 years ago. About 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens came into the picture. Even earlier than that, but about 50,000 years ago, something special happened. What anthropologists and paleontologists call the Great Leap Forward. Why do they call it the Great Leap Forward? Because all of a sudden, 50,000 years ago, about 50,000 years ago, we got more brain power. So the ability for abstract thought came in. And most people hypothesize that this came in because we needed to interact with our other fellow men. And we needed to be able to anticipate what they might be thinking. And so herein started what I'd like to call mythopolitical artifacts or mythological artifacts. They were narratives, so that we could communicate with each other, smaller groups. And it was around this time, about 50,000 years ago, that in Europe, Homo sapiens moved in and quite possibly wiped out another species of hominids, the Neanderthals. Now, this is a special instance because the Neanderthals were about, on average, 20% person to person stronger than Homo sapiens. And their brain to body mass ratio was higher than that of Neanderthals. Now, brain to body mass ratio is a sort of crude calculation anthropologists and paleontologists use to measure the intelligence of a species. So Neanderthals were possibly smarter than us and assuredly stronger than us. And yet we wiped the Neanderthals out. We were bigger groups. Now let's make another movement. Let's go to about 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, we got agriculture. Agriculture meant civilization. For the first time in the 200,000 year history of Homo sapiens, of our species, we had what we could call surplus. We weren't just hunting and eating and then moving on. We could have things for storage. With surplus comes the idea of property. With property comes the idea of ownership. And this is what, if you ask people like, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they'll tell you this is where all the trouble started, or the politics started. We'll talk about politics a little bit today. This is where the trouble started. But here, you needed bigger groups. There was more surplus, so villages, cities were being created. And so you needed more solid mythopolitical mega structures. And these started coming in the form of religions. And these were the narratives that we shared with each other. So you go to ancient India, and the Aryans were the higher caste. You go to ancient Egypt, and the pharaohs were descendants of the god Osiris. So these were part of the mythopolitical megastructures. So one, we got around this time the mythopolitical megastructure. And the second thing we got is the mode of socialization. So how does this mythopolitical megastructure, this narrative, how does it spread? Through a mode of socialization, which was at that point in time the temple. So those two things we got with the start of civilization. Now let's go back about 300 years ago. About 300 years ago, we got the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, everything again changed. Because 10,000 years ago with agriculture, with property, one thing had come in, we got a zero-sum game of running for wealth, property, and land. It was a zero-sum game. If I have it, you don't have it. But 300 years ago, after the Industrial Revolution, that zero-sum game all of a sudden turned into a non-zero-sum game. Everybody could gain from trade and commerce. And so the old mythopolitical megastructures could not work. And so people like, thinkers like John Locke came up with the ideas of equality and liberty, things we call today democracy. And so this was the time of the birth of democracy, and democracy became the new mythopolitical megastructure. And the mode of socialization, we still had the temples, but now we had the factories, we had the offices, we had the schools, we had the town halls. So things changed again. From a zero-sum game, we went to a non-zero-sum game. Now let's come back to our modern day, where we are today. Today, things have changed one more time. Today, we know more than we ever knew before. We have more information available to us than we ever did before. And yet, a lot of the information is the sort of thing you see right there. Fake news has become common terminology today. So we have a lot of information. Even though we have a lot of information, and some of that could be bad information, even having said that, over the last 50 years, if you look at the work of James Flynn, what we call the Flynn Effect, we are actually getting smarter. All around the globe, we are actually getting smarter. So those graphs will tell you. IQ points across the board are going up, all sorts of IQ. Across the point is going up. So we are actually smarter. No matter what your parents might say or what your grandparents might say, you are smarter. But we are still making poorer decisions. The reason is we are bombarded with too much information, what we call bounded rationality. So we are making poor decisions. So that was a bit of the history of our socialization. Now let's come down to the alienation today. So what's happening today? We have all the information in the world. We are connected today more than ever before in the history of humanity, in the history of this planet, quite possibly the universe. And yet we feel alone. We feel alienated. We feel distant from our fellow man. Why do we do that? Why does that happen? That happens because today, more and more, we are getting caught up in what we'd call filter bubbles. Most of our time is spent online. How many of you have a social media account? How many of you spend at least 10 minutes a day on social media? That's almost all of you. How many of you spend about an hour or so a day at least on social media? That's still all of you. So can you understand how engrossed you are, how engaged you are in the world of social media? Now, there's a problem there. There's a good side, there's a bad side as well. The big problem is social media is designed to keep you engaged, to keep you there so that you don't move on, so that you get a dopamine rush, you get a serotonin rush, so that you're happy. And to make you happy, social media always has to agree with you. So Google, Facebook, YouTube, any form of social media you can think of has special algorithms built in to agree with you. So if you are a liberal and you don't particularly like conservative ideas, all the time you'll be bombarded with liberal ideas, and you'll get more and more distant from your conservative neighbor. So we all each get caught up in our filter bubbles. Now, there are good sides to this as well. The whole world becomes a community. A particular study from the University of Chicago looked at 4,000 people who started dating online, contrasted with 8,000 people who started dating people they met through friends, family, or at other social places. And on average, those 4,000 that met online were much happier than the other 8,000, and the divorce level was much lower than the other 8,000. So people are even starting to find their soulmates on social media. That can't be a bad thing. But there is an isolation. So you're globally connected, but you're locally disconnected. And that's why you see everywhere, ideas are in clash. Ideas are in contrast. Never before in the history of the USA did a liberal hate a conservative as much, or a conservative hate a liberal as much. The divisiveness between Republicans and Democrats were never as great as it is today. I don't even need to start talking about the divisiveness between Dhaner, Shish and Noka. That becomes a problem. So we are finding our soulmates all over the world, but we are getting alienated from our next door neighbor. And this is a problem. This is an acute problem, especially for democracy. And we're going to talk about that. So when we get alienated, we don't understand or try to understand our next door neighbor. That's when the non-zero-sum game that we were talking about turns into a zero-sum game again. My neighbor is different from me. We don't have much in common. Then why should I share with him? He becomes my enemy. So after 300 years of playing the game of democracy, a non-zero-sum game, we have gone back and started playing a zero-sum game. And this is helpful for people with autocratic tendencies. For political leaders who want to be authoritarians. And so we understand the 4 key indicators of authoritarian behavior. Rejection of democratic rules of the game. Just look at Trump, look at Putin. Denial of the legitimacy of political opponents. We can go back to the picture we last saw. Toleration or encouragement of violence. And finally, readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including the media. Those 4 items have become common increasingly all over the world. So the alienation that we feel today is fuel for the fire of the authoritarian tendencies of autocratic leaders. Because democracy, this is a view of some previous elections, but democracy is based on your locality. Democracy is geographically bound. Governance is geographically bound. So if you're alienated from your neighbor, then you're not sharing in the same mythopolitical megastructure. That narrative for you has broken down. And I can tell you, I have traveled across this nation. In another talk the other day, I misspoke. Of the 492 upazilas in this country, I have personally been visited and worked in over 200 upazilas. And in these journeys, I saw a few things. One, I saw that there is a general lack of connecting with our neighbors. We connect more to those bubbles, be that one brand of political identity or a different brand of political identity. We connect more with those bubbles than we do with our fellow neighbors. So we have broken down that mode of mythopolitical narrative megastructure. And second, today, especially the youth, our mode of socialization has become the internet. That creates further divisiveness. So, if we are to come back, what we see today is because of this alienation, because of this zero-sum game, a new brand of politics has started. A new brand of politics where large political parties are trying to revert back to a feudal past where they're creating a feudal structure throughout their nations and using state resources for patronage of that feudal structure. There are a few examples right there in pictures. And this is not just happening in 1 or 2 countries. This is happening all around us. This is happening in our neighboring country, all around us. And that's a big problem. Because if you allow that to happen, The chance of democracy actually breathing life again is very, very low indeed. So what we need to do today is start thinking very long and very hard about this issue. And we need to start focusing on how can we localize those narratives again? How can we connect back to our locality again? Because remember, governance is connected to your locality. And if we can't find ways to do that, be that the temple, the mosque, the mandir, the church, be that new town halls, be that new local internet hubs, if we can't find that, then things are not going to change. Then this feudal network of patronage nationwide is going to stay on. And democracy is not going to get life breathed into it. But I believe that we can do that. I believe that we can recreate those modes of socialization. The mega-narrative of democracy, the mytho-political mega-structure of democracy, we can breathe life back into it. All we need to do is create those modes of socialization. And the moment we create a new mode of socialization that's locally bound, we can ensure that democracy in this country and everywhere else enters the modern age unsullied. Thank you very much.